Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Melnick. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering here at Networks. Joining me again is Liam Cleary, who's always interesting, always entertaining, so welcome.
Thank you.
And today we're going to talk about Teams and how your Microsoft Teams can be compromised. So I know it's a big concern for people. So before we do that, we'll talk real quick about kind of housekeeping. Again, everybody's on mute, but please ask questions. I'll try to grab questions out as we go. We'll kind of switch off a little bit. Worst case, we'll pick them all up at the end. But if you have questions, please throw them in there. I know you're dying to know if you'll receive a copy of the slides and a recording. You will. So no worries. We're going to try to keep this to about 60 minutes. We may run a bit over. We're going to try to be cognizant of your time. But if there's a lot of questions, again, we'll try to answer them all. We don't want to go too far. We don't want to stretch it to 2 hours. But worst case, you have to drop off. Again, you'll get the recording. So real quick, we'll talk about the agenda. So again, why Microsoft Teams? That's probably a kind of a no-brainer for everybody here at this point who's on this webinar. But talk a lot about architecture, obviously attacks, protections, and then I'll talk about sort of the 5 ways that you can strengthen security through networks as well. And then again, we'll dive into the Q&A. So again, if you have questions as we go along, please throw them out there. Liam, go crazy. I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Cool, thank you. Well, hello everybody. So the first thing we'll talk about is why Microsoft Teams in the first place. So in the past 5 years or so, there's been some great advances in platforms such as Skype, Google Hangouts, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc. And then, of course, increased use of video and chat applications across the board. So I'm sure, like I have kids, and they're obsessed with every single application that lets them do video and things like that. But actually, what's interesting now is that more of us are at home now. So we're actually at home working because of the pandemic that's took place. And actually going forward, it's probably going to be more of a commonplace to actually work from home and potentially use video. I remember all those years ago that one of the things that I always used to struggle with as far as video platforms go is that it wasn't really personable. And often if you had kids and they made noise, somebody would often moan about it and say, hey, can you mute your mic because it makes noise? But now we're all in the same boat. And so I often join calls and there's people screaming in the background and dogs barking, and it's all good fun. So it's become more personable now. We also find that Microsoft Teams specifically has become a critical platform for most organizations. So when the pandemic hit, if you remember, Zoom was like the video platform of choice, and then Teams has kind of caught up. Now Teams, the reason why it's been used so much is it's also the front door to lots of other capabilities within the Microsoft stack. Now, of course, the last thing here is, of course, the Microsoft Teams, the competitors, are being attacked. So why wouldn't Microsoft Teams be attacked also? So that's kind of where we're going to start today in the premise of that. So before we get to that, though, I want to focus on the Microsoft Teams architecture of what that looks like and what we need to understand as far as how Microsoft Teams was kind of architected and works together. So the first thing that we have here is right in the middle here, we have the Microsoft Teams services. So it's a combination of specific services that Microsoft brought together, but it's wrapped around by other services that are part of the largest stack within the Microsoft infrastructure. So we have the Skype infrastructure, so Skype for Business, and also the Skype Consumer is part of that process too. Then, of course, we have the Azure stack, which is the core crux of everything in the Microsoft cloud. So Azure Active Directory, and then all of the Azure services. And then, of course, to the left of that, we have Office 365 platform and services that kind of are connected to and make up what effectively is Microsoft Teams. And then, of course, over the top of that, we have the Teams clients themselves. Now, this can be the Windows client, the Linux client, the Mac client, the mobile client, and also the web browser. So there's a bunch of entry points here and a bunch of technology that's kind of wrapped under the covers in Microsoft Teams. So how does Microsoft Teams fit into Microsoft 365? Well, first off, we need to understand that it's just one moving piece, a presentation layer within Microsoft 365. It's a representation of consumed services that are brought together in a single view pane. So think about this logically. If I have access to a Microsoft team, then I'm potentially going to have chat conversations. And some of those chat conversations are stored in Exchange Online. Some of those one-to-one chat conversations are stored in things like OneDrive. If I'm uploading files in Teams, then we're going to be storing things in SharePoint Online. But if I'm utilizing one-to-one chats, it's going to go into my OneDrive. And then, of course, we have Teams construct itself, which is connected to a whole bunch of other technologies, including the beginning piece, which is Azure Active Directory, which is where the security for a Microsoft team comes from. So you have to understand the difference here between a team and a one-to-one or one-to-many type conversation. So you probably join Teams meetings now where you're just invited to a meeting and it's kind of limited on what you can do. But then you can go into a team and you have full-blown access to do whatever's needed. And the security around that is wrapped around the Azure Active Directory security group that's created as part of the Microsoft Teams. So what does the logical architecture look like when we look at Microsoft Teams? Well, it's kind of broken down into, if we break it apart, we have you as the individual user. So there's your purple bit there, that's you as the user. And then, of course, you as the user have access to OneDrive, chats, meetings, call-ins, activity feeds, and then you've got the tabs and the applications that are available. On the other side of that, you have contacts that you can communicate with, which come from either Exchange or Azure AD. But the crux of all of this is what's referred to as a modern group. A modern group was a construct that was built a while ago, which was Microsoft's first attempt at kind of putting things together. So when I go in and provision a group, an Office 365 group, I get a SharePoint, I get OneDrive, I get Exchange, I get Planner, for example, I get all of these connected services that are managed under one umbrella. So what's the difference between an Office 365 group and a team? Well, team then brings the conversational piece to that and the video. So effectively, a Microsoft team is an Office 365 group that just happens to have that piece applied to it. Now, within the teams, when you provision a team, it creates logical storage locations within a SharePoint site collection, and it creates folders for the content to be stored. Now, of course, if you create channels, channels are just for, private conversations, let's say, between groups of individuals. But you can also create private channels, and a private channel spawns out another site collection, which is different to its parent site collection too. And so bringing this all together is obviously the connected services that come from the Skype capabilities and link, whatever you want to call them, which will be the emojis, the stickers, the giffies, all that kind of fun stuff, and the messages. So when you look at Microsoft Teams, you have to remember that if you allow someone into a Microsoft team, you are actually allowing individuals to come in and access not only the Microsoft team, but also the supporting services underneath. So that's a critical thing to understand. And whatever you can do in a Microsoft SharePoint site or a OneDrive site or a team or something else, all of those you can do if you have access to the Microsoft team. So I want you to kind of think about that as we kind of talk a little bit further. So when we talk about Microsoft Teams, not only do we talk about the logical architecture, but we also talk about the data entity storage and how things are kind of defined together. So in a team, we have these kind of core components that are available to us. So we have messages, images, files, voicemails, recordings, calendar meetings, contacts, telemetry, all this kind of stuff that's built up as part of a team. Now, as far as where all of these go, messages, obviously, the chat service table storage is obviously in the process of being moved to the Cosmos DB architecture. You've then got images that are stored in blob storage in Azure. The files, as we talked about, are stored in SharePoint as well as OneDrive, depending on the types of conversations that you have. The voicemails will go into mailboxes in Exchange. The recordings for voicemails or video recordings will go outside of Exchange into media services. So, for example, using blob storage again. Calendar meetings, obviously part of Exchange. Contacts are from Exchange. And then the telemetry goes into the massive Microsoft data warehouse that you technically don't have access to, but you can see that when you go through the login capabilities and see what's there. Now, a couple of things obviously that Microsoft does here is that they ingest some of this information. Some messages get ingested to Exchange Online, media service stuff, the images get ingested to Exchange Online, and then you get recordings encoded into Microsoft Stream. So if you're looking at, I'm going to refer to it as the tentacles of Microsoft Teams. That's my new phrase, and I'm going to coin it, is that you have the team, and then it reaches far into the Microsoft 365 architecture to utilize multiple types of components. So when we think of the Teams components, what do we kind of get? Well, Teams creates underlying components. So you get a hidden shared inbox, a hidden shared calendar, you get the shared document library, you get the OneNote notebook, and you also get the SharePoint team site, and then the persistent chat-based workspace. All of the membership for that and security controls are mapped to that Azure Active Directory group. So if you add a member to the underlying group, it gets replicated to Teams. If you add a distribution list to the team, then it will do a one-time expansion and then invite that to individual members. And then you can also use dynamic membership as well. So if you wanted to, assign yourself permission to a team, you can either do it within the team or have someone do that for you, or you can get access to the Azure Active Directory group that controls everything. Be aware that the supporting services, for example, like SharePoint Online, things have been removed from the SharePoint site collection so that you can't add the permissions using the user interface. So you need to actually go into, PowerShell, and you can make changes there. Or there's other ways of actually doing that. So now that we talked about kind of the basics of the actual kind of team architecture, what we're talking about is Microsoft Teams attacks. And what are those specific attacks that have been utilized, or things that you could do that could be deemed as an attack on Teams? Now, there were two core Teams attacks that have been kind of caught in the wild, I suppose. The first one is automated notification emails. So this one is a common one that isn't just team specific. We see this all the time for things like Facebook and Google and things like that, where you get an email that looks like an automated message that says, hey, you have a message or something to respond to. And in actual fact, it's a phishing or a credential harvesting email. But they're crafted phishing emails. The landing pages that you go to look identical to, for example, the real login page. There's actually quite a few tools available that will do this. And also you can use GitHub to do a search for Office 365 login, and you'll find a bunch of PHP pages and a few other bits and pieces that people have created that can represent what the login page looks like. But of course, they don't do that. What they do is they present you to the login page, and then you type your credentials and they go nowhere. And then I get your credentials and off we go. They often use newly registered domains, and it's all about stealing employee credentials for Office 365, because that's the key, really. The most common way of breaking into something is to get someone to give you credentials. And whether you're in Microsoft Teams or not, Office 365 is a big attack surface to kind of play with. The second and one that was a recent one, which Microsoft have now patched, was around an image upload attack. So this would allow you to retrieve the authentication token of an image by having them go, of an authentication mechanism by going to an image. And then you could actually then use API calls to kind of retrieve information from the context of that specific user. And so two different types of common attacks. Now, we could spend a while talking about the Office 365 different attacks that are not team specific, because all of those that are known and in the wild are also eligible for breaking into Microsoft Teams. Because if I can somehow get someone's credentials or get someone's authentication token or something else, then I can do other things in the tenant and then circumvent and come into the Microsoft team itself. So when we think of the Microsoft Teams kind of attacks, we kind of break this down into a few different types. So I'm going to wait for these to render out. So the first one could be some kind of malware that's obviously stealing credentials. Let's say I'm on my Mac, I get some malware and it steals the credentials. Maybe it's a keylogger, so fairly straightforward. A common one has been legacy authentication. So even now, Microsoft want to block legacy authentication protocols, but they don't do it by default. kind of a slight correction on that one. If you have a new tenant from after October 2019, then security defaults are enabled and legacy authentication does get blocked. However, if you were before that, then it doesn't get blocked, and so you can still utilize some of those capabilities. Of course, we talked about phishing emails and malicious images. Also, malicious links are quite common, just pointing a link to something else. Obviously, it has to get through the security controls and protections first. And then, of course, malicious documents. This was quite a common one more recently, which wasn't a Microsoft Team attack. It was more of just a general OneDrive SharePoint attack, but you can see the logic here based on the architecture. If I can break into OneDrive, I can then traverse up and down the tree to where I need to go. So the idea being here, it's a malicious document. You click into it and it will do something. So these common attack vectors still stand. And there, of course, there are things that you can do to kind of protect some of this, but most of this is still kind of available. And in all fairness, most successful attempts into breaking into Office 365 really come from the phishing email, because at the end of the day, the weakest link in our chain is the end user. So if somebody was able to gain access, then what could be accessed? Well, within a Microsoft team, you have access to the teams, so all of the teams that are available, and then potentially any of the channels that have been created, as well as any of the chats and messages within Teams. Now, is that a problem? You know, is the fact that you posted a bunch of Giphy images and pictures from you being at the beach or whatever else, is that really important? Probably not. But maybe the projects that people are working on and the documents that are being shared, maybe that's an important thing that you wouldn't want to be accessed. Then, of course, if we talk about outside Microsoft Teams, even though it's technically through the Teams canvas, the outside one would be files that are stored in SharePoint, which are surfaced in Microsoft Teams, or OneDrive files, or any of the connected applications, for example, that are in Microsoft Exchange or a Planner or Power BI, whatever's connected into that system. So what can be accessed depending on the kinds of users that you come in? So in the ideal world here, what we're hoping for is that the person that clicks on the link or does whatever it is that first person there, that global administrator. If it's the global administrator, we get access to everything. Doesn't really make a difference at that point. You may not be able to get the password. If you did a phishing email, maybe the password came through, but you know, at least if I had a global admin account credential, then of course I could do whatever I wanted to. Now, of course, our second one down would be a Teams administrator. Maybe the person's account that we got access to is the Teams admin. That means I can go and mess with the Microsoft Teams. I can delete Teams, add new ones, modify certain restrictions and controls and make them so it's not as secure. Maybe I want to get the SharePoint administrator. I can get access to everything in SharePoint, which would include all of the content inside Microsoft Teams that's stored in SharePoint document libraries, and I can get access to that one. Even though the SharePoint administrator doesn't naturally have access to the Office 365 group team site collections, as a SharePoint admin, you can simply select them and add yourself as an owner, and then you get access. Maybe it's the site collection owner that you get access to. You know, I can manage the site collection. I can then change permissions. I can change content. I could then upload malicious content if I needed to. And then, of course, maybe it's a lowly site owner. I use the phrase lowly because they're isolated to a specific sub-site. And so maybe I get access to that so I can modify permissions and content. Because if I'm trying to be malicious here, one, it's about gaining access to content, but it's also, as most malicious actors will do, it's about persistence. So being able to say, well, I'm in here and now I'm going to stay here. And there's nothing you can do because I'm now inside here. Okay, so let's go and have a look at what we can kind of do. And I'm just going to change my screen here for a second. So let me just pause that one. And then I'm going to change my screen. I have lots of screens to go to. Okay, so I'm inside. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. Okay, there we go. So I'm in a virtual machine here, which is a Ubuntu Linux. And I'm actually logged into my Office 365 tenant in one screen here as the global admin. And then I'm also logged into the person's email. So the idea being here is that we could utilize any number of tools to be able to try and get information about the user. But I'm going to use a toolkit that's available, just the Office 365 toolkit from MDSec. And so the idea being here is that someone sent me an email. So here's my email. So it looks like a valid email. In actual fact, it's going to be a spamming email, but let me just zoom in. We can look at the message here. I actually wrote this myself, so I'm quite proud of it. It says, over the past few months, we've been upgrading and migrating to Office 365. As a security precaution, when you click this link here, we need you to do this because the timesheet application that you use has now been migrated. And so, it looks like a normal email that you would expect to get from somebody. So how you get that to them, that doesn't really make a difference, but I have an email that's been sent here. Now, under the covers to this, I'm going to launch my terminal here, and I actually have the Office 365 attack tool framework that's running on specific ports. So this is all local, so I'm not doing it out in the wild. But what's going to happen is I'm actually going to click on the timesheet application. Now, of course, it goes to a white page that just says unauthorized access. Now, let's go back to my message. Oh, I did say that you'll get an unauthorized access message, and you'd have to click login to get through that. Now, of course, we would make that look nicer, obviously, so it looks like a legitimate one. So I'm going to click sign in. It's then going to go, and I need to refresh my browser for 2 seconds. Let me just change that. Okay, so let me just refresh. Okay, so I'm going to click sign in, and you'll see that it went away. It just popped up and went away and nothing happened. Now, of course, I would be suddenly thinking, what's going on? What's going on? But what's actually happened is, as far as the end user is concerned, obviously, if it says localhost, it's not going to work, but that would be a valid URL. What's actually happened is if I go into here, you'll see that it's now logged an entry for my test account. And most importantly, I now have an access token and a refresh token. Now, that's important because now that means I can do specific things at the Microsoft Graph, or maybe using PowerShell. So I can do things. So if we just run through that so you can kind of see the idea, I clicked a link, it goes here, I click sign in. If I wasn't signed in, it would ask me for credentials. I log in with credentials and it still does the same thing, but under the covers, it stores the information that I'm looking for. So I get user principal name, the mail address, the name of the person, access token, and refresh token. Now, let me just, oops, I actually wanted to change my screen. Give me 2 seconds again. Make this out of that. Okay. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm flicking to a separate machine now, and I'm utilizing PowerShell. So the idea being here is that I have a access token, which is there, which is that access token. I populated a variable called token access token. And so what I can do with it here, remember that I haven't logged in, I don't have access to the tenant. The end user did that for me, and I got the access token. So I'm going to execute this, and you'll see it gives me some kind of basic information from the access token itself. So I can pass the information out, whatever it needs to be. What I can then do is I can then invoke certain things. So I can say, I'm going to pass a header, and then maybe what I want to do here is execute an invoke request. And if I just click users here, you'll see it tells me that I have a connection. Now, notice what just happened. I haven't logged in. I basically have an access token, which is all it is. And yet I'm able to pass that token, that bearer access token that I've got, to a request. And if I just say select users, it gives me a list of all the users in the Azure AD tenant. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means the person that I've managed to get the credential for probably has higher permissions than I was expecting. I was assuming it was going to be a simple user. Now, if I repeat the same process and say, get me information about my profile, I can then click me, and sure enough, I managed to get an administrator account. Now, this doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. So I have a higher level access account, which means if it was an administrator, a security admin, or someone with permissions in Azure AD, and actually you would think that administrators are not the ones that click on these links. You would think, but actually it's quite common. So what it means is, because I have that level of access now, I could do this. So this now shows me all of the documents in that person's OneDrive. So bear in mind, I can go ahead and I can get the information. So what I can then do is I can say, well, think the logic through. I want to attack Microsoft Teams. So what I'm going to do is go and get the Office 365 groups first, and I'm going to filter it. You can see it here to unified, which basically means I'm getting the Office 365 groups. So I'm going to execute that, and sure enough, it gives me a list of the groups that are there. So I'm actually going to go into here because I already have the ID listed from previous. Let me just copy and paste that, because I'm thinking I want to use Contoso IT, because Contoso IT comes up in the list of groups here. So I know that it's a Microsoft team, and I want to be added to Microsoft team. So I got that. Now, of course, oh, wait there. The problem is I don't know the password for the user. So that's okay. Well, let's go and get that group. So I have the identifier for the security group that I wanted. So I took the ID from this one and pasted it here. And now I'm going to do something which I'm going to caveat is only able to be done based on the permissions of the account that we've managed to get access to. So what's going to happen is here, I'm actually going to go ahead and create a new Graph API call. So I'm going to say invoke the method here. And then I'm just going to go and select my user principal name. So now I actually have an account. So what does that look like? Well, let's just go back into here, go back to here, and back to here, and I'll just click on users in my domain. Now, of course, I'm going to say H4, and sure enough, my account was created utilizing the Graph API. So interesting. So Graph API call right there. So I'm able to have created that account, and I did caveat that based on the permissions. This doesn't always work, but the access token can either be used to kind of do things to the specific user or to do something else if the account has access. So I have my hacker account that I just created here, which is valid. If I click on licensing, you have no licenses. So, oh, actually, I need to assign a license. So I already know what the SKU ID is for Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to create a body for the license assignment. And then I'm going to invoke that request again and say license associate. Oh, I think actually, oh, I've got a different ID for the user. That's what I should have got. Give me 2 seconds. And my ID is not that one. So I'm going to copy this ID here.
Hey, Liam, there's a ton of questions too. I don't know if you want to field some of these or if you want to.
I saw them popping up as always.
Okay, no worries. I didn't want to stop your flow, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to.
Yeah, go ahead while I just copy and paste.
Sure, yeah, no worries. So actually, there's a ton of questions in here. So, so are Microsoft tokens really not bound to an IP in the authority flow at this point?
No. So what's interesting here is when you allow someone to come in and do that process and you take the tokens away, it's not really bound to anything specifically. And actually, the authentication piece that the end user did, the consent flow, you didn't see that because I already had consent flow enabled. But it's not done by me, the malicious actor, it's done by the end user. So the end user is the one that says, I put my credentials in and then I consent. And at that point, it really makes no difference because the end user has consented to that application. And then it makes no difference where that comes from because at that point, I get the access token anyway at that point.
Nice. So, and this is something actually we were talking about briefly earlier. So how does this work when multi-factor authentication is being used?
So yeah, so the interesting bit for that is the multi-factor piece is tied to the authentication piece in the beginning. So if you remember, if I go back to my other screen here, and when I clicked on sign in for my unauthorized access, if you had multi-factor enabled, it would prompt you for multi-factor at this point, because you would need to pass the multi-factor if it asked you for credentials. Now, if you were already authenticated, like when I clicked sign in and it just kind of went away, if you'd already passed the multi-factor, it would never prompt you. Now, once I have the access token doesn't rely on the multi-factor at that point because you've already passed the multi-factor authentication and the access token is valid. Now, of course, the access tokens don't last forever. So if I sat here for long enough, the access token that I have right now would expire and I wouldn't actually be allowed to add that specific thing because it's timed out, and I would have to wait for someone to click on that again. So it's a limited window that you have to utilize the access token, even though the access tokens are exactly the same potentially. So no matter how many times I could run this process, my access token and refresh token will be exactly the same as they were the first time, except in the architecture, it will just time out those ones. So you have a short window that you can actually utilize it.
Okay, cool. I think that answers that question as well. Could you have done that without admin privileges? So in other words, if it's
Um,
just a user account.
if it's a regular user one, regular users can't create users inside the domain of Azure AD. However, what you can do here is if the account has the right access, and this comes down to configuration, then end users can actually invoke the guest invitation process. So what that means is if you manage to get the access token of the person, you could potentially call the REST API endpoint to be able to say, I would like to do an invitation and invite an external user, because in most tenants I've ever looked at, external sharing is enabled because they want it there anyway, which means that the Graph API endpoint tends to be open sometimes because people want to utilize that, and I have permissions, and so I could technically invite another random email address, like hacker@gmail.com or whatever, and then invite that account. That email would be sent. I would then confirm that, and I would not have to create an account. I would then have magically been invited to something. But it's all based on permissions around external sharing and invitation and Azure B2B.
Cool. And then I'll ask one more, and then I'll get back to
Okay.
because there was a couple in here that were, well, there's a ton in here about like this really works with even if MFA is enabled. How long is the window open for this to work with multi-factor before the token expires? So basically, how long is the timeout window? And then there's some other questions about is that timeout window adjustable?
So some of the timeouts are adjustable, but a lot of them are set by default as part of the Azure AD. And it also depends which endpoint in the graph that you utilize as well, and which endpoint. So when you're utilizing the application OAuth, which is basically implicit flow, then you're kind of ring fenced to an Azure AD token. So the nice thing here, well, it's not a nice thing for someone who's trying to do this, is that the Azure AD access token doesn't necessarily allow you to run that against Microsoft Online services directly. So what this does is this type of access token is ring fenced to Azure Active Directory and Graph API calls. You couldn't then reuse that on something else. So there are some limitations in this flow, which is as expected, and it should be that way. But I mean, as far as the timeout goes, I can run this for about 15, 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then it will time out. And if I try to do some of the commands a bit further up, it will say this is now timed out and won't let you execute that same thing. And so then you're kind of stuck, which is why I try to wrap everything quickly into a bunch of stuff. And then I end up with an account inside the Azure AD that kind of lets me do what I want it to do. So you
Cool.
kind of have to be quick if you're going to do it.
On that note, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Okay, so once you have like the access token, then of course I can pass it into all these different bits and pieces here. So I have to get my user ID a little bit here and make sure I have the right one. And then of course I can pass that and add a license to the user to say this is the license that I want to assign, which would be a Microsoft Teams. And then of course what I can do at this point is add using the same thing. I can say go and call the endpoint here that says directory object. So the directory object will be me as the end user. So if I go and just put that there, so this is the end user, and this one here is the reference to the group. So I can say, go and get me the user, which is the directory object, and then I can say add to the security group. Now what's just happened is that security group, if you remember, was the one that we picked out here, which was Contoso IT. So if I now go back into groups for my user account, you can now see that I'm a member of Contoso IT. We know that Contoso IT is actually an Office 365 group that's been associated. So let me just open up a different browser here, and I'll drag this across in a second. So let me just bring that here. So I'm logging in as this specific user now. So there you go. I have no license associated to me at the moment. But if I do teams.microsoft.com and just browse in the web browser, now that I'm logged in with that account, we'll wait for this to load. It'll come back with a license error code, and it kind of sits there for a bit and says you're eligible to have a trial. It's okay, so we'll let you go in. And then you can see I get the first team. I get the Contoso, and what'll happen is it'll refresh. Let me just get rid of the let's go. It'll refresh in a little bit, and the other team, the Contoso IT one, will appear here once it's kind of finished doing its setup. So I mean, I suppose all in all, what you could technically end up with is if you can do it fast enough and you do it within the access token and the refresh token time, you could, if you have the right permissions, go ahead and create an account, add it to the right group, and then you'll ultimately get access to the teams that are here and be able to get access to the content. And then, of course, once that loads, I'll be able to see the files that have been uploaded and access the SharePoint site, etc. So that was kind of a quick kind of show of how that works. So let me just go back here to number 3. Okay, so obviously that was a quick demo on all the way through, but how can you protect from that? That's obviously the critical and key here is like, well, how do you protect from that type of attack? Well, the good thing is that Microsoft do a bunch of stuff anyway. So they protect from things like compromised key attacks. So the Teams uses PKI features to be able to handle some of the transport layer communication. There's network denial of service attack. So Teams mitigates against those attacks by utilizing the Azure denial of service network protections that are there. And also it will throttle clients depending on what's going on. So if you're trying to do something major, I mean, Azure in general and Azure AD will throttle requests depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to do a bunch of manic PowerShell, the odds are you'll get throttled at some point. There's protection for eavesdropping. So Teams uses mutual TLS between Microsoft 365 and Office 365. So that kind of attack is very, very complicated to achieve. Also identity spoofing. So Teams authentication is performed with certificates and authenticates using encrypted traffic. There's also man in the middle attack protection as well. So Teams audio, video, and application sharing utilizes the SRTP, so the Secure Real-Time Transport Protocol, to encrypt everything all the way through. Also protection for RTP replaying, so using that same SRTP protocol with secure signaling protocol, it protects from being able to replay. SPIM is the coolest name for anything. So SPIM is unsolicited instant messaging or presence request like spam, but it's focused on Teams. So it doesn't necessarily protect out of the box from that, because based on your configuration, so for example, if you have external users enabled and guest access and you don't have any protections there, then technically I could look you up, and if my tenant allows me to add guests, I could then solicit and send messages to you. And then of course there is protection for viruses and worms. So Microsoft obviously uses its own services to scan and look for viruses and worms at that point. Now outside of that, there are some specific protections. So Teams protections, things that you can do to protect yourself. So the first one is creating channels to control Teams. So instead of having these big buckets of all the information, create channels to isolate content out and utilize private channels too, so that it can kind of be segmented out. Utilize integrations with existing Office 365 services. So I'm talking about the security capabilities that are enabled. So for example, if you wanted to block certain types of content, then you can utilize general protections within Microsoft 365. Limit any of the third-party application integration. You'll see that whole thing we just walked through is really based around allowing an end user to consent to an application. There are ways of restricting that. Implement Teams policies. So within Teams Admin Center, you can define policies that will control how things can be communicated, who can share, who can not share, what can be added, what can be not added. Do we block GIFs? Do we allow GIFs? Do we allow, the emojis and things like that? You have those levels of capabilities. And then implement information barriers. This is one of the less talked about features in Microsoft Teams because there's no user interface for this. This is done utilizing PowerShell. So the idea being is you logically create effectively a network barrier between groups in the organization. So for example, Department A cannot logically speak to Department B because those are the information barriers. It's all managed via PowerShell. I have yet to find organizations that utilize this, but it's actually quite a powerful way of restricting access to Teams. Then, of course, you need to look at the sharing protections. So obviously, files stored in SharePoint, you obviously need to look at protecting those. You can classify content, so utilizing some of the extra services that are available, such as unified labeling, Azure Information Protection, rights management, define content policies. You can also prevent file downloads to unmanaged devices, so restricting access to people that come in to a Microsoft team. We can utilize the CASB components and conditional access and actually block downloads. Obviously, you should be enforcing multi-factor authentication anyway, but you can enforce it on external users if you need external users to come into the team. And then, of course, you can utilize the audit capabilities that are available. And then I wrote something weird on the slide that says RIVE files. That's actually not a real one, but obviously being able to put policies around the files and also the OneDrive files that are available, not just in SharePoint, because most of the time people think of Teams, they think of SharePoint, but what they misunderstand is the OneDrive files that are also in the one-to-one chats and the one-to-many chats that people or even admins wouldn't necessarily know was there. And then, of course, protections around connected applications, restricting who can gain access to those. So in general, there are some Microsoft 365 protections that we can kind of deploy or at least utilize. This one goes normally across the board anyway. So enforce least privilege of all accounts, enforce multi-factor for all accounts and not just the internal, but also the external users, because that multi-factor is going to at least help you, or at least even if it doesn't protect. I mean, I talked about this in a meeting earlier today that I said it's interesting that we think multi-factor is the answer to protecting at the door, but actually what happens is you have a bunch of end users that have cell phones that have applications on for the authentication, and then randomly they'll probably get an authentication request and they'll think it's their phone and they'll just approve it. In actual fact, that could have been a malicious actor trying to get in. So we've seen that multiple times again and again and again. Limit external sharing to the trusted accounts. There are configurations for this. Definitely block email client forwarding rules. Just be aware, that is one of the common attacks that take place when somebody can circumvent or break into, at least get access to Office 365. One of the first things they'll do is put forwarding rules inside Exchange Online. That actually seems to be a common practice now. And then they'll generate further phishing email and attack. And then my last thing here for you is to utilize Cloud App Security, or CASB. This is the Cloud App Security broker mechanism, or even if you don't use Cloud App Security, it's use a Cloud App Security model application, a CASB, because it sits around the outside of everything as a protective layer. And so you can put all these protections in place and put them there, but then of course you're still going to need to go through and look at how to monitor that and how to keep track of everything. So I'm going to hand over to Jeff now, who's going to talk about how to keep track of things in Microsoft Teams.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Liam. Let me do this. Let me switch up my, yeah, there we go. Oh, there we go. Is this thing on? There we go. Cool. Okay, perfect. Hopefully you can see my screen. If you cannot, please let me know. Awesome. Okay. Got way too many screens. Screen madness.
Yes.
So going to talk about 5 things to keep track of in Microsoft Teams. I know this was certainly some questions that you guys had out there as well. So we'll start to dive into that, especially, sorry about that. Overexposed sensitive information. So we can certainly go through, we can look for sensitive data residing out in Teams specifically. Again, as Liam mentioned, one of the things that's interesting is it's so tightly integrated with SharePoint, Azure, Exchange Online, there's stuff everywhere. So a lot of times you'll see certain things being generated in Azure, certain things being generated in SharePoint Online, but I'll show you kind of what that looks like. So you can go out and find sensitive data in Teams. You can also automatically go through and quarantine that data as well. I'll talk on that briefly. Permissions and user activity, again, knowing who has access to sensitive data, detecting any changes to sharing settings, and also spotting and investigating suspicious activity, specifically around sensitive data, but we can do it with regular data as well. And then I'll show you a little bit of guest activity, not a huge amount, but definitely going out there and adding a guest into the teams. And privilege elevation, again, knowing whenever a new team is created, you can see team ownership changes as well, or creations. And again, basically keeping an eye on group membership changes. That's really mostly how that's going to come about. And then there's excessive rights granted to applications as well. So with that having been said, let me kind of dive in. I'm going to drop the slides off, and I'm going to show you how this works. So let's start off with number one, which is the ability to find sensitive data. So here we can go in. I can go in and look for threat data discovery and classification. Again, it's going to be SharePoint Online. So the ability to go in and find sensitive data by site collection is kind of nice because it'll give it to you exactly as it's laid out. So for example, this is actually SharePoint. It's my accounting site collection, and here's my HR site collection. And then here's all my stuff for Teams that gets dropped down here, which is going to be some of my HR stuff, etc. Some IT stuff in here. Not a huge amount of data, certainly not data that's specifically sensitive, but again, I could drop this out. I just want to look at documents specifically, and I can see what documents are flagged as sensitive. In this case, they're just file size, but here, this particular one here actually has some sensitive PII data in it, for example. And again, if you've got PII data up in Teams, pretty much everybody has access to it. So you need to be somewhat careful. And I'll show you again, you can determine who actually has access to this as well. If you want to be able to go through and kind of collect and quarantine this data automatically, you can do that as well. So if I pop over to here, see I've got a bunch of different sources, including some of my SharePoint Online stuff, some data, etc. I can go over here, create a workflow. You can also do data subject to access requests as well for you guys who are dealing with that joy and compliance. And then you can create a workflow. So if I just kind of walk through the wizard real quick, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it. I'll say, hey, all types of documents, click next. I can migrate a document, I can copy it, etc. And then let's say I want to drop it some sort of quarantine folder. I could drop it somewhere else within SharePoint Online, but in this case, I just have a quarantine folder set up on a file server. And then I can basically walk through and have it do a bunch of stuff. Again, do I want to move the document, make a copy of it? I can mark the source on read or read only, append data to it. I can redact data as well, which is kind of a cool feature also. But just to give you a quick heads up as far as those types of capabilities. So if you've got files out there that probably don't belong sitting around on Teams, you can pull those out. So let's look at being able to find let's see, I'll throw on some other ones here. So most overexposed sensitive data objects. Again, if you need to know who currently has access to sensitive data, you can do that. And you can see, again, this is kind of broken down. Here's my, shared documents IT channel and some of the documents that are actually out there. And you can see everyone except external users have access to this. As opposed to my, legitimate SharePoint sites, I can drill in and I can see again exactly, what users specifically have access to this and what that level of access is. So it gives you kind of a nice overview of what's actually going on, as opposed to, again, some of my shared data out on Teams in this case. You can also go through, again, looking at things like activities, sensitive data rather. Let's see, I don't know if I've made any changes the last 2 days, but let me go back a bit. And again, anything that's sensitive that's been read, added, created, etc., will roll up in here as far as documents. It's an access request, etc. So any sort of documents that roll up, and you can see there's a number of different documents in here that sort of meet those guidelines as well. So in this case, I'm looking kind of generally, but again, I can sort these, I can filter these out as well. so I can look at a specific, um, site, specific Teams channel, etc. Based on, you can see how this is rolled out, and it's counting 2. Yeah. So again, you can definitely go through and take a look at some of that information as well. You can also go through and look at group membership changes. Now, hilariously, you can see some of that in SharePoint Online, but you can also see that in Azure. So if I go down here to group memberships, it gives me a little bit more detail. And again, I can see, and this is just me logged as my admin account, I should probably log into something a little bit more interesting, but you can see all the different users that I've added in here, um, and who currently now is a member of this management team in this case. So again, pretty easy to pull that information in, and exactly what's going on. You can also, which is interesting, so there's a couple different ways. Again, you get a lot of, I hate to say noise, but you get a lot of duplication related with different things that pop up. So for example, again, you create a team, it's going to create an Azure group, which you'll also get rolled up into SharePoint with some of the replication, etc. So if I go here into, one of the things I found is actually kind of nice is user accounts created and deleted directly in Azure AD. So this is one of these things that we've always kind of looked at, and I'll actually run into this, especially again with hybrid. If you're creating accounts on-prem and they're replicating up, you probably don't care if those accounts are being created within Azure. You probably care more if they're being created directly within Azure, like Liam kind of went through and just bam, created an account. That's a little bit different story. So in this case, if you go through and you create, if you invite an external user, it will create an account specifically up within Azure. So this is a really easy way to go through and see that I invited this person here, which is of course me and my normal work email, to have access into this team. And then again, you can track this again based on kind of the who, if this person comes in and actually starts doing things. So again, gives you a little bit more visibility into what's actually going on and breaking that out. So that's in new groups. So again, I can go out and look at things like within Azure, new groups as well. So again, edit groups, where are you? Account management. Blanked out here, actually. Let's see. It's going to be one of those days. It's been a long week. I apologize. Yeah. So again, you can see a lot of this information and how it rolls up specifically. Again, new site collections you can go through. Obviously, these are just basic reports, but if I drop this out, you can see there's actually quite a bit of information I can pull through the search as well. So in this case, I'm just looking at Azure AD and SharePoint Online data. Everything that's not successful logons, because I'm just not interested in that at this point. And then again, I'm just looking at the last 7 days. And then I can kind of roll through here. And in this case, I've got all kinds of stuff. Again, I can kind of include this and say, hey, I just want to see group changes. Click search, and again, kind of refine this data a little bit more. One of the things you'll see as well is you will see this. Actually, I was clicked on it earlier, and that'll learn me for doing these. Oh, here it is. So it'll tell you if someone's made an owner as well. So if someone has actually made an owner in this case, you can roll that up as well. So I could go in here and do a search within the details and say, hey, details contain owner. And then I can find, hey, this person was made an owner within this particular group. So a lot of different stuff. And then obviously with any of these, I can create custom reports as well. Pretty straightforward. I can also create alerts this way as well. So the filters get populated automatically. I can see exactly what's going on, and I can kind of roll from there to generate this data and say, hey, if someone's created as an owner, for example, I could do that pretty easily. So you can even have this, in fact, take actions as well, which is kind of cool. So if you want to run a PowerShell script of some sort as a response action, you can do that. Maybe take that user out or something of that nature. Do you want to be careful when you're scripting replies, because we've certainly seen, there's certainly been issues where customer goes out, creates a script that does something, and they didn't realize, how that it was affected, and they wind up in this weird loop where they go in, try to add stuff, and it keeps getting torn out automatically. So We've certainly seen that type of activity as well. So you do want to be somewhat careful when you drive those out. So I realize I'm running out of time, so let me throw my slides back up very briefly, and then we'll dive into the other questions that are out here. Actually, there's a poll, which I totally need to ask. So let me do that right now. So, sorry, I have, again, way too many windows and not enough real estate here. One of the problems with working from home. There we go, cool. So the poll is out here. Basically, which use cases are kind of most critical to what you guys are looking for? And there's overexposed sensitive information, permissions and user activity, guest activity, privilege elevation, excessive rights granted applications. Liam, if you had a guess, which ones are, or which ones would be the most here in this case?
Honestly, I would bank on any of the first three. Like,
I think
yeah, I mean, genuinely, and like privilege elevation. I mean, it's quite complex to do anyway. I mean, and if it would be people in the organization that would do it, and then excessive rights granted applications. I mean, obviously we talked about that, but obviously those top three, I would say, from what I'm seeing in my conversations, it tends to be guest activity. People are worried about because they're not quite sure where people have got access to, and then it tends to be overexposed information in Teams. So I'm kind of thinking maybe one of those two.
Well, I think you're mostly right. That's kind of a hedge answer, but yeah, the first one was
Oh, look at that! I
overexposed
was
sensitive
close.
information.
I said the top three. Oh
Yeah,
no, the
oh yeah.
excessive rights was higher. Ah,
Yeah. So,
I
well, I guess
apologize for
activity
being
was pretty close.
incorrect.
It was pretty close. I think you got edged out the final few
Yeah,
minutes there.
yeah.
So we've had a couple people too just throw in the comments, which is last three or yes or so definitely a few of those as well. So just want to wrap this up and we'll get through all the other stuff and then we'll dive into Q&A. If you have any questions about this product, again, it was kind of a short demo. You can go you can kind of play around with it in our in browser demo where you can kind of gives you kind of a walkthrough. You can also download the product and play around with it as well and spin this up and do an eval. If you have any questions, by the way, if you're running the issues, please reach out to us. We support the product fully during the eval. And of course, we can do a more in-depth sort of one-on-one demo. So with that having been said, and to try to keep things mostly within parameters, wow, it's 2 minutes left for questions. That's awesome.
You better speak quickly.
Yeah, go. Let's see, there's a ton of questions in here. There we go, okay.
And some of these we did answer as well.
So yeah, and so there's some other comments in here as well. So this sounds like it's more mitigation than prevention. Yeah, obviously it's like anything else, right? There's a reason to audit, because sometimes things happen, right? Obviously there's prevention, and then there's making sure that your prevention works. It's like anything. Unfortunately, I'm not going to say that one product is going to meet all of your security needs because that's just not the case. Someone else asked about the recording. Yes, those will go out there as well. Oh, so we need to audit the permissions in an easy view way, which MS does not provide. Yeah, that's correct. So again, if you want to look at something like SharePoint permissions, pretty easy to do. You can also see things like Exchange permissions as well through networks. I kind of buzzed through that relatively quickly, but I can certainly show that to you in more detail. Oh, sweet. Okay. So a lot of great feedback. So just terrific webinar. We're working on Teams, and this was really eye-opening. So that's awesome. Let me scroll up because I think I missed some of these questions earlier. We were just kind of blowing through as many as possible. This is oh, interesting. Okay, so does the sensitive data report require sensitive info policies to be enabled on Office 365? No. So in this case, there's actually at Networks we have a data classification mechanism, and you can set them up. There's a lot of out-of-the-box mechanisms. You can create your own as well. So there's a bunch of built-in ones for things like PCI, CCPA, GDPR, all that kind of good stuff. You can create your own as well if you've got specific types of data. Like I've created them for legal. They're relatively simplistic to create. We can also write back to data as well, by the way. So if you're migrating into the cloud, for example, and you want to use Microsoft's labels. We can actually write the labels to documents as well on-prem. So as you migrate up into SharePoint Online, we can do that pretty easily. Those types of things. And then again, you can leverage a lot of the DLP protections within Office 365. Okay, Liam answered that one. Did you see anything else in here that were kind of critical that you don't think we hit?
Just having a quick look now. He's trying to read them all.
Yeah, I know there's a ton of them, and I unfortunately I kind of broke things a little bit. I think yet we had a bunch of really relevant questions that popped in earlier, and because I know whenever we go back to those, it's always like, wait, when was that? What were we talking about?
Yeah. So there's a question that says, can an admin know if their Teams has been compromised? Honestly, no. I mean, you would never know. I mean, unless you're monitoring every single active connection that's coming in and vetting that that's the right person that's coming in, then no, you'll never know it's been compromised. You have to rely on your end users to kind of flag things up. And it all depends how they get access. Like if they did something as silly as I did, which was, create an account, then you would never know. But actually, if you had login, like if you're using the Networks Auditor tool, that would flag up and say there was a new account that was just created. So like you would be notified of that. So there are some ways of doing it, but unfortunately, it's the same for anything. I mean, I worked with an organization a while back that had a compromise, and by the time we'd looked at what they'd been doing in the audit log, I mean, there was like 3 months, 4 months of somebody in there doing stuff, and it wasn't necessarily malicious, but they had no idea. They had no idea. I hate to give you that answer, but
Yeah, no, we've definitely had a lot of clients that come to us and said, hey, it's often very eye-opening when you dig into it. So
yeah.
actually, we had a client where they came to us and it clearly, after we kind of took a closer look, it was clearly a brute force attack. But the first thing they realized that something was wrong was when they looked into their domain admins group, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a user in there called Bob with no other attributes,
Nice.
and they're
Yeah,
like,
the infamous Bob.
yeah, they're like, what? How did
Yeah.
this happen? Yeah, and then we saw, yeah, there was just tons of like failed logons, just crazy.
Nice. Oh, that actually goes with a question actually where someone said, can you create an account with any name? And I mean, technically, yes. But if you do have some policies in place or you're utilizing applications that can check that, then that would get flagged to say like, oh, the name didn't match the naming convention that you were expecting. But yes, effectively, I could have called that account anything I wanted to. My go-to name is David Smith because it's like the common name, and no one ever goes, "Who's David Smith?" No one knows. So if you ever see David Smith, unless it is David Smith, it's probably a test account.
That's awesome. Uh, let's see. So how can you block downloads to unmanaged devices
Okay.
be achieved on Teams desktop app?
So Teams itself doesn't necessarily have some of those capabilities yet. So remember that Teams is just the canvas to the other applications. However, SharePoint does, and you can use a conditional access policy that will let you block the downloads of the files. So interestingly, what will happen is if I was in the Teams interface and I said open in SharePoint, I would get a banner across the top that would say, you cannot download files. It would actually stop you with a screen that would say, this is being monitored and you can't download things. And then you kind of get blocked at that point. But there's not an official checkbox that just says block downloads in Teams. Doesn't quite work that way. But yeah, I mean, I would utilize, it's a mixture of either cloud app security for session controls or it's going to be conditional access. That's the two kind of options that you've got right now.
Cool. Here's actually two questions for me. That's cool. So with the auditor, can I see all the permissions and access per user in SharePoint for internal and external users? Yes, you can. We can pull it up actually pretty easily. It'll even show you if there's inheritance issues or if it's been broken, etc. And then just to clarify, because someone kind of called me out on this, it says, there we go. So you're saying that no PHI or PII or sensitive data should be in Teams or SharePoint. There's a ton of stuff in SharePoint, but in Teams it's a little bit different story, I think, because a lot of the permissioning in Teams is, hey, yes, I just want to be a member of this team, right? Like you can set it to be a little bit more specific,
Mm-hmm.
but you probably want to know more so within the Teams portion, because again, it's all in SharePoint Online, rather than say in your HR portion, your legitimate dedicated SharePoint site. So that's my just way of going through and saying, hey, especially floating around in Teams versus your more likely more heavily locked down SharePoint stuff.
Hmm.
But
And
again, anything in the
you could also bundle that too. So this is where we talked about the wider Microsoft 365. So this is where you would utilize data loss prevention, for example. So DLP in Teams is fairly real time. So if someone does paste, PII data or PHI data into there, then we can restrict it and remove it right away. If somebody pastes the credit card number in, it gets removed. Or you can go the other end of the spectrum and say, if someone starts swearing and stuff and profanities in there, we can get rid of those too. So there are capabilities available, but I wouldn't necessarily say as a blanket statement, don't put stuff in there, but it's very careful consideration. And if you're utilizing other components such as Azure Information Protection for protection of the files and stuff, then it's not so much of an issue. But you do, I suppose, if there's one thing I could leave with everybody is that if you're going to do Teams, to do Teams properly, you need to make sure you utilize the supporting services. Like you just have to, otherwise it just isn't going to work the way that you expected.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah, again, it's just a lot of times it's just a matter of knowing where your sensitive data is. If it's in a place that's pretty locked down, no worries. Again, it goes back to the old file server issues as well. If you've got a lot of sensitive data in your public directory and everyone has access to it, probably not a good idea. So cool. Let's see. That was answered. So many questions.
I like Rob's one. It's actually on my list of things, just so you know, Rob. It's one thing that I've been thinking about, which is the PowerShell to basically enumerate the protections. So I'm going to do a shameless plug now. So I wrote the basic security setup for Microsoft 365, an article recently. It's on the Microsoft community, Microsoft 365 documents online, and you can see the top 10 things that I recommend setting up. As part of that, what I'm working on separately is I want to actually go through and take that with a mix of the CIS benchmarks and PowerShell script the whole thing out. So I'm not going to work on it right this second, obviously, because I have lots of other things to do. But I am working on it actively because I would love to be able to provide that and say, this is what you should implement, and here's the PowerShell script to go with it. And then it will check the settings, let you know what they are, and then apply them. And then be able to do 2 different versions of the CIS benchmarks. If you don't know what they are, then you have level 1, level 2. So level 1 CIS benchmarks and level 2, which breaks a bunch of stuff. But so that's kind of one of the things that I'm working on separately.
Cool. And I have a bunch of questions which apparently I skipped over. So is Nurse Auditor licensing available for MSPs? Yeah, we have MSP specific licensing, so feel free to reach out to us. Can you pull a report on a specific user? Yes, you can certainly go through and filter those, and you can also go through and see, what site collections they have memberships on. So that's certainly something you can do. I answered, I think, the question about labels already. Again, we can label them. We don't need to see labels. We'll actually go through and automatically pull out data based on our own rule sets, which answers that question as well. Yeah, you can definitely do ad hoc queries. That's what I was kind of tinkering with earlier. Again, you can search on anything without just going through the report. The reports are designed to be helpful, but you can just do ad hoc queries as well. I think that's it for me. I'm just rolling back through as far as one.
Somebody said, are you aware of other entries for hackers into Teams other than credential harvesting? So, I mean, realistically, your entry into Teams can be via anything in 365. So that's the most important thing here. It doesn't really make a difference which entry point you come in from. There was a question further up that said, what about accessing Visual Studio Online as a potential way to come in? And it's interesting because Microsoft is moving us as well as many other vendors into the single sign-on same auth token being used across multiple services and applications. And so Azure AD token can be used, authentication can be used for VSO, so Visual Studio Online. And so that could be an entry point, or you could get an Azure AD token and then get access to something else. So they're all kind of connected in the way that the authentication process works. So there definitely are other entries predominantly, and this is a good thing, that you're predominantly going to have to be focusing on getting credentials of some description or having an end user do something in an application. I said to a bunch of people the other day I was talking, I said, if I had time, I would write an application, get it approved in the Microsoft Marketplace, and then tell people to install it in Microsoft Teams because it does something amazing, like it shows cat pictures or something weird, just like doop, 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 slides of pictures, and people would add it in. But under the covers, it would get information about the end users. So there's plenty of avenues, but there's also not many avenues. And so like legacy authentication is still an entry point because it's not disabled in lots of tenants. So they can still be abused in coming in that way. So if you are testing, I'm going to use testing as the phrase, not actually hacking other people's 365 environments. If you're testing, then there are other ways of getting in, but it's getting less and less and less, which is a good thing.
Cool. I think we've got about everything. I'm sure I missed a couple. Guys, I apologize if that's the case. Got literally 100+ questions in here. And actually, Rob said, I think you need 90-minute sessions so you can offer 15 minutes of Q&A. But we actually did quite a bit of Q&A. In fact, actually,
yeah, and we did some
we're
one
wildly
in the
over.
middle.
Yeah, I think we did about 25 minutes of Q&A actually. So
yeah. So maybe we should do Q&A for like an hour next time.
Yeah, exactly. Is there an online portal where more questions can be submitted out? Yeah, send us questions over. We'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have. So with that having been said, I'm sure we're going to get the hooks shortly. I want to thank you all for attending. And Liam, I want to thank you again as always. It's always interesting to see you cause some havoc in the Microsoft stack. So let's see what kind of havoc can be done. So I want to thank you. Cool. And everyone else, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day. And again, hopefully you all found this to be useful.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.